Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. The Minolta XG-M and I have a very long history together. This was my very first camera that I bought almost 15 years ago, and I learned absolutely everything with it. So today we're going to take a closer look at the camera and all of its features. I'm going to share probably a few of my favorite memories I have with this camera over the last 15 years or so, and of course, a lot of photos that I've made with it. It's odd that I'm just now doing a review of this camera, but I am really excited about it. The Minolta XG-M was first released in 1981, and at the time of release, it was their top model in the XG series. It was also known as the X70 in the Japanese market. Fun fact, this is actually Minolta's first camera to use this logo that you see on the viewfinder prism, replacing the previous version. It's pretty basic in terms of its features and functions. It doesn't really have any kind of advantage over a lot of other SLRs of this era, but it works, and that's the most important thing. Taking a look at the top of the camera, you see you have your exposure compensation and your film speed selector on the left-hand side with your film rewind, as well as your shutter speed dial on the right-hand side, ranging from shutter speeds of 1/1000th of a second all the way down to 1 second or bulb for long exposures, and if you switch it over to A, that puts you into aperture priority mode. The shutter release button itself isn't threaded for a cable release, but you do have a cable release option over here on the side of the lens mount. The camera does rely on batteries, and it uses two LR44 button cells, which is pretty common of SLRs from this era. Your sync speed, if you'd like to use a flash, is 1/60th of a second, and it's highlighted in red on the shutter speed dial just as a reminder. You do have a hot shoe on top of the camera as well as a sync port on the lens mount, and you also have a depth of field preview button on the lens mount as well. And if you need a self-timer, there is one on this camera using this little switch right here. You lift that up and that activates the self-timer mode. The one lens I've had for this camera all these years is this 50mm 1.4 MD Rocore X lens. This Rocore lens is still to this day one of my absolute favorite lenses that I own just for the character alone. It does vignette when you're shooting wide open. It's not the absolute sharpest lens that I own when shooting wide open, but it has this dreamy kind of glow to it that I just love. And that could easily be nostalgia speaking, I get that. This is literally the only lens that I used for several years, so there's a lot of just kind of nostalgic bias built into that, but I just love this lens. Even when I was using my Fuji X cameras just over the last few years with the X-T1, 2, and 3, I would often adapt this if I was shooting portraits for a wedding or a family or anything like that. It just has such a unique look to it. One thing I really wish this camera had was being able to see the shutter speed that you're set to inside the viewfinder. So you can see what aperture you're set to, but in order to know what shutter speed you're using, you have to take the camera away from your eye and look at the actual dial itself. You don't get that information in the viewfinder. Now, the reason this can get annoying is because inside the viewfinder, you just have an LED light that will light up next to the shutter speed you need to use based on your aperture. So you aren't working with a plus or minus LED or any kind of needle meter where it's just telling you, you're either overexposed or underexposed. This is going to tell you this is the specific shutter speed needed, which is great because it's precise, but at the same time, you're constantly doing this back and forth thing. If I'm looking through there and it's telling me you need to be shooting at 1/250th of a second, I have no idea whether or not I'm actually on that, so I have to look down here and make sure, and it's just sort of this back and forth thing. Obviously it's not a deal breaker, and I worked with this camera for years around that. It's just not as quick and intuitive as some of the other cameras. All in all, it's a really simple 35mm SLR that doesn't have anything that's really groundbreaking with it, but it's just simple and effective, and it works, and it's really cheap. To this day, Minolta is just constantly slept on. I mean, Jonathan King Japes, he's always been, Minolta gang and all that, so he understands, and he's been telling people for years that Minolta is a great brand, but honestly, I bought this camera almost 15 years ago for $50, and it was the camera body and the lens itself, and you can honestly find a lot of these around the same price today. And back then when I picked this up, I wasn't looking for specifically a Minolta XG-M. I didn't know anything about different film cameras. I had a little point and shoot camera that I was given that I just immediately fell in love with photography, and I thought, I want to learn everything I can about this. So I just asked my mom, hey, what was that old camera you used to have? Because I remembered using her Pentax K1000 years ago. I had no idea what it was, but I did photography for 4-H. So we went to the Smoky Mountains as a kid, when I was a kid, for a family vacation, and I just shot some photos with that for my 4-H project. And I really enjoyed it, but I never really pursued it, obviously, until years later. So I was like, hey, what was that camera you had? And she goes, oh, that was just an old 35mm camera. And I'm like, okay, cool. hopped on eBay, typed in 35mm camera, and this was one of the first things. And I thought, okay, I think it vaguely looked like that. It was a silver camera and had this black kind of body, the leatherette wrapped around it. $50? Okay, sure, I'll take that one. And that's how I came up with this camera. Buying cameras back then was a little bit simpler. Now you didn't have all of these YouTube reviews and forums and all that stuff, so kids are spoiled these days. But I bought it and just immediately started toying around with it and just trying to figure it out. I didn't know what aperture was or shutter speed or anything like that. I didn't have a photography mentor or a class. It was just a lot of trial and error. I would go to Walgreens and buy up all of their cheap film they had there and go to the skate park or go wherever with my friends and shoot it and drop it off, pick it up an hour later, and just try and figure out what I did and how it affected the images. And it was just a lot of really slow process learning, but I'm really thankful for that. I just took this camera with me everywhere, you know, whenever I was hanging out with friends or at the skate park, and then I got my license, so then I was driving everywhere, going to other skate parks, hanging out with friends, and this is just always the camera that I had with me. Even after I got into DSLRs several years later, I still always carried this camera with me, and this was just sort of like my personal camera that I used for my own life. You know, the DSLRs and stuff like that were always great for the work that I was getting with bands and senior portraits and families and weddings and all that stuff, but this always stayed in my camera bag just as like my tool for my own personal life. And it's really interesting now, looking back at some of those really old photos, I can start to see almost like the origin of kind of my own personal style that I was like kind of getting towards, but I was really just shooting everything. But it's interesting looking at photos I shot almost 15 years ago of my friends, and now using this exact same camera and lens to take photos of my family. It's just really, really interesting. I've bought and sold 1 million cameras at this point, and I have a couple of cameras that I always say I'll never sell. My Leica M6 is one of them, but this is easily just as valuable, if not more valuable to me as my M6. I mean, I've used that camera to document a lot of really important moments with my family, my kids being born, my wife on our wedding day, but this, to me, this is just where it all began. I will never part with this camera. What's funny, too, is about 10 years ago, I went to Hocking Hills in the middle of winter with my buddy Castle, and it was just snow and ice everywhere, and I brought this camera and my Nikon D90, and I ended up forgetting to pack the batteries for my D90, so my only camera was my film camera, my Minolta XG-M, and I had this with me the entire day. We were over there at the Rock House where there are these steps that go all the way down. It's pretty far, and all of the steps just had ice just rounded over them, and it was just slick, and I literally was like a deer on ice all day long. I can't count how many times I fell that day on the ice, but I had this camera just strung across my body like I normally do, and I slid down these stairs, and this camera bounced off of every single step all the way down, probably at least 15 stairs, I would say. This thing just bounced off of everything. I got up, brushed it off, and just kept shooting with it, and to this day, it's still working. So these things are tough. Minolta cameras really just don't get the credit they deserve. The lenses are amazing. This thing is held up for years and years and years of abuse, and last year I had a little bit of an issue where things were kind of overlapping. I was getting overlapping frames on some of the rolls, but here recently I haven't gotten it fixed or anything, but I haven't had that issue, so I don't know, maybe that was a fluke, but this thing is, it's still hanging in there. So before we wrap up, I'm going to take a minute to pay some bills and thank our sponsor today, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is the best all-in-one platform for you to build your online presence. You can show off your work, sell your prints, or any other merch throughout your online store, and keep tabs on everything with the analytics on the back end. As photographers, our portfolios are always growing and improving, so updating your portfolio should be a simple process, and with Squarespace, it's incredibly easy to update or rearrange your portfolio at any time. Having your own online store built into your site makes it really convenient to update your inventory, add or remove certain items, run sales, anything you might want to do when running your own store. You have so many templates to choose from when designing your website, and they all look great and are easy to customize, but if you ever do need any help at all, Squarespace has 24/7 award-winning customer service. If you'd like to try Squarespace out, you can do so entirely free at squarespace.com, but when you're ready to get signed up, go to squarespace.com/mattday and you'll get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video today, this sort of retrospective review of the Minolta XG-M. I really enjoyed talking about this today, if you couldn't already tell. It was a lot of fun, honestly, to just go back and look through so many photos over those years where I was just a kid, kind of trying to figure it all out and figure out my path, and just feels good. Feels good to talk about it, feels good to share that with all of you guys, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely give the video a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you're new here, there are new videos every Monday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But that's it for today. So thank you guys for everything. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.